So why don't we get started? Good morning to all of our friends in the US and good afternoon to our friends in Europe and in Israel. My name is Francesca Bregoli and I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Cuny Graduate Center. I'm delighted to welcome such a large group to our first public event of the fall semester. Today's program will feature a conversation between Professors David Ruderman and Shaul Magid about David's most recent book, Missionaries, Converts, and Rabbis, the Evangelical Alexander McCaul and Jewish-Christian Debate in the 19th Century, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press a few months ago. I want to alert you to a 30% discount, which is being run currently, and you'll find the code in the chat box. We will start with an introduction by Professor Ruderman, followed by a conversation between him and Shaul Magid. And towards the end of the program, there will also be an opportunity for questions from the audience. And because we have a fairly large audience today, we will use the chat box for questions. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat box and I will read it for you towards the end. This event is being recorded and it will be later uploaded to the center's YouTube channel. So I want to invite you to please keep your microphones muted. And again, feel free to turn off your cameras if you have any concerns about privacy. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. It is such a personal pleasure for me to introduce my mentor, my teacher, and my colleague, Professor David Ruderman. David is the Joseph Meyerhoff Professor of Modern Jewish History Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was also the Ella Darivoff Director of the Herbert Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania for 20 years, from 1994 to 2014. Prior to Penn, he taught at the University of Maryland and at Yale, where he helped establish both institutions' Judaic studies programs. David's work has made tremendous contributions to the study of early modern Jewish history, Jews and science, the debate over the Jewish Enlightenment, and Jewish-Christian relations more broadly. He has trained a generation of graduate students at Yale and Penn in early modern Jewish history, and I count myself very fortunate to have been among them. Professor Ruderman is an extremely prolific author and a great communicator in both scholarly and lay settings. He has written 9 single-authored books and co-authored, edited, and co-edited multiple volumes. I'm not going to be able to mention them all here for the sake of time, but I will mention my favorites. His first path-breaking monograph, The World of a Renaissance Jew, The Life and Thought of Abraham Faisal, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 1982. Jewish Thought and Scientific Discovery in Early Modern Europe, which was translated into Italian, Russian, and Hebrew. His Jewish Enlightenment in an English Key, Anglo-Jurist Construction of Modern Jewish Thought, which won the Court Award for the best book in Jewish history in 2001, and Early Modern Jewry and New Cultural History that again received the National Jewish Book Award in History in 2011. And I'm skipping many, I'm also skipping many of his very influential edited volumes. His 2 most recent monographs are a best-selling Hebrew book of the modern era, the Book of the Covenant of Pinchas Horowitz and his remarkable legacy, and the book that he will present today, Missionaries, Converts, and Rabbis. Together with David, we're also really fortunate to have one of the preeminent scholars of Jewish thought and American Jewish thought with us today, Professor Shaul Magid. Shaul is the Distinguished Fellow in Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, and from 2004 to 2018, he was a professor of religious studies and the J. and Jeannie Schottenstein Chair of Jewish Studies in Modern Judaism at Indiana University. He's also a senior research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. His areas of interest and research include Lurianic Kabbalah, Hasidism, American Judaism, and contemporary conceptions of Jewish religiosity. He is the editor and co-editor of many books. I'm sure many of you also know him as a commentator on issues of religion and politics. He's a regular contributor to Tablet magazine, Tikkun magazine, and his essays have also appeared in Zik magazine, Religion Dispatches, Open Zion, and Moment magazine. He is the author of Hasidism on the Margin, Reconciliation, Antinomianism, and Messianism in Izbitza and Rajin Hasidism, From metaphysics to midrash, myth, history, and the interpretation of scripture in Dorianic Kabbalah, which was awarded the 2008 American Academy of Religion Award for Best Book in Religion in the Textual Studies category, American Post-Judaism, Identity and Renewal in a Post-Ethnic Society, Hasidism Incarnate, Hasidism Christianity and the Construction of Modern Judaism. And his latest books are Piety and Rebellion, Essays in Hasidism, and most recently, also from Penn Press, The Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament, Elijah Tzvi Soloveitchik's commentary to the New Testament. Earlier this year, Professor Magid wrote a thoughtful and thought-provoking review of David's book on Tablet magazine. And so we thought it would be very interesting to bring them together for a live conversation. So without further ado, David, the screen stage is yours.
Jessica, thank you very much for your generous introduction and for your very kind invitation. And it's wonderful. I usually spend the time, going and looking at who's sitting here, but I'm too busy now, so I can't do that. But if you know me and I know you, I want to say hello. And to the rest of you I don't know, I would like to meet. There is obviously a great advantage to Zoom, but there's a great disadvantage. As I said earlier, you can't go out and eat afterwards. But in addition to that, I can't greet you all. But I'm thinking about you in any case. And I'm really honored that all of you are here, and especially Shaul has agreed to be my interlocutor. We once were on Zoom at a different time, and I screamed out, "We got to go on the road." So I guess this is as close as we can get to the road. So we'll pretend like we're in Manhattan, but we're obviously not. But anyway, I'm wasting time. Let me get, so I want to do something very briefly. When I usually have a longer time, I would speak in great detail about the book. I'm going to give you a very quick overview. I do want to sort of nudge it in the direction of what Shaul was saying in his commentary on me, because I think that really offers us a very interesting way of talking about this. And in the course of that, I guess you'll get a picture of the book if you haven't read it already. So let me talk very personally and very directly about my project, what I've done, and what I hope to do in the book, and then we'll see where we go from there. And then, of course, I'm watching the time now. I have 10 after, so certainly before 11:30, I will stop, and we will open up a conversation, which Shaul, I'm sure, has some really tough questions to ask or comments. As most of you know, my previous work is as an early modernist. I am interested in the intellectual and cultural history of the early modern period. And therefore, going into the 19th century is a bit of chutzpah. That chutzpah is usually associated with old age. After you get tenure and you retire, you don't give a damn about what people will think about what you're writing. I did get a lot of help on this book, and I consulted a lot of people. But in fact, I know I'm it's one thing to teach 19th century Jewish history, it's another thing to write about it. But I've been seemed to be moving all along. Maybe it's the influence of the history department at Penn, where I began my work, as Francesca mentioned, in the 15th century, and now I'm entering the 19th century. So I guess before I die, I need to write a 20th century or a 21st century book. But I might leave that to Shaul. He's much better at that. In any case, the project is not unconnected, even though chronologically and even geographically it goes beyond my limits. There are clearly two major interests of mine that I pursue in this book. One is the complexity of Jewish-Christian interactions, which has been at the heart of so many of my other projects, beginning with Avraham Farisol in the 15th century, in the 16th century, several monographs in my interaction between Jews interested in science and the larger culture and Judaism. Even in Sefer Habrit, the Book of the Covenant, which is clearly a work on Kabbalah and science, but is also struggling with the issue of how a Jew relates to the non-Jewish world. And I should mention parenthetically that I guess by coincidence, or maybe not, Shaul also reviewed that book earlier. So we've been having an exchange, or at least he's been responding to what I've been writing for a number of years. This book considers a conversation between 8 people. One missionary, 2 of his Protestant evangelical colleagues who disagreed quite strongly with his approach towards the Jews, 2 converts that were deeply influenced by the missionary whose name is Alexander McCaul, and 3 Jews, 2 Maskilim, extremely well known in Europe, Samuel Joseph Feen and Isaac Ber Levinson, and a rabbi from Aleppo, which really took me beyond my capabilities, but I again got help from specialists named Raphael Kasim, who ended up writing on McCaul as well. The central focus of all of these 8 people is a work called Nitivot Olam, or that's the Hebrew version of the Old Paths, a work that McCaul published originally in English in 1837 as an attack against the rabbis and the Talmud, and then was translated by one of the converts who I deal with, Stanislaw Hoga, in 1839, and became known as Nitivot Olam. The book was subsequently translated into many languages, including Judeo-Persian, Yiddish, Arabic, Hebrew, French, German, et cetera, et cetera. And as far as books go, particularly when they're given out for free, you do pay a price, of course, when you take this book, but thousands upon thousands throughout the 19th century circulated. So I think it is fair to say that in the area of Jewish-Christian polemics, it had the widest circulation of any book of its genre in the 19th century. This conversation is, of course, a virtual one, like our Zoom conversation. Whether some of these people met each other, but others did not. But they're all speaking about similar things. And what I find interesting here, I mentioned McCaul, I should mention, at least by name, the 2 others, John Oxley, who is an extremely learned evangelical from England, Charlotte Elizabeth Tona, who is also an extremely learned and influential editor of Christian evangelical journalism. Both of them become very close to a group of Jews in England and develop relationships and become known as the good Christians as opposed to the bad Christians associated with London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Among the Jews, which of course was McCaul's major organization. McCaul's biography is very interesting, and I really won't speak about it in great length. He came to London, where he originally had been a student of the sciences, was influenced by Joseph Fry and others, and studied for ordination. Was sent in the early 1820s, soon married to Poland, to Warsaw, where he hung out for 9 years. He had learned Hebrew and Yiddish, and he became a so-called expert of rabbinic literature. He came back and then he assumed several posts, being the head of Palestine Place, which was the place for training those who wanted to enter into the missionary ranks. And soon he became also a professor of post-biblical studies at King's College. I had the wonderful opportunity a number of years ago, thanks to Andrea Schatz, of actually lecturing in the same department where Alexander McCaul was a cleric and a teacher. And I remember the provost walking into my class with this enormous cross, and I really felt I was in Alexander McCaul's presence, even though, of course, he wasn't there. McCaul is an extremely interesting figure. He wrote about 50 works that deal with aspects of Jewish culture, was quite a scholar within the context of Christian culture of the 19th century. And his view of Judaism is mixed. Like everything else about this book, it's mixed. If I want to use a word to describe this book, it is about ambiguity, it is about complexity, it is about ambivalence, it is about murky entanglements rather than clear adversarial positions. In other words, this is a Jewish-Christian debate that I'm describing, but indeed, all of the participants are extremely complex in their own right, and their positions are not so clear. So starting with McCaul, and I'll do this very quickly because there's too much, I can't give you that much nuance. McCaul loves Jews. He writes commentaries on Jewish commentators, particularly Kimchi. He deeply cares about the Hebrew language. His family spoke Hebrew and wrote in Hebrew. His daughter and son-in-law made Aliyah, and he was the chief counsel in Jerusalem for the Protestants, James Finn. The family was extremely devoted to the study of Jewish culture. He loved Orthodox Jews. He writes about Hasidim with extraordinary passion and appreciation. He puts down, although he has this flirtation with Reform Judaism, because he sees it on the way towards Christianity. At the same time, he sees that these guys are not authentic enough for him. They don't read literally the text. And since he is a literalist, he appreciates the kind of learning and the culture that traditional Judaism in Eastern Europe had created. At the same time, of course, he is anti-rabbinic. He attacks the rabbis for their lack of appreciation of the non-Jew, their lack of appreciation of women, their incapability of seeing the larger picture of Judaism, which of course is Hebrew Old Testament Judaism, a return to the purity of what Judaism is. He comes out of a certain love affair. You could say this is all rhetoric, but if you keep reading him over and over again, you see that this missionary does this not for political calculation, as some have described him, but rather out of a deep commitment to what he believes to be Judaism and the place of Judaism in Western civilization. The other two who I write about are really counterpoint. I won't really describe their biographies, I don't have the time, but John Oxley and Charlotte Elizabeth are evangelicals as well. They care deeply about the conversion of Jews, but they also love Judaism and Judaism. And the primary Jews and Judaism, the primary difference between the two of them is that they do not believe that proselytizing or converting Jews to Christianity is the proper means. The way the second coming will come about is if Jews go to Palestine, are encouraged to go, observe the halakha, observe their beautiful rituals. At the same time, they will, as Jews, usher in the coming of Jesus and the coming of the redemption. And therefore, their commitment is to stop proselytization, to stop the missionary advance, to stop forcing or encouraging Jews in all kinds of ways to convert to Christianity. And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, they and several others are embraced by the Jewish press, the voice of Jacob Franklin, who is the editor. Jacob Franklin and Charlotte Elizabeth Tona, I describe it in my book, become very close friends. And when she dies, he writes a obituary on her, which is an extraordinary accomplishment for a Jew who deeply loves a Christian. And pours out his heart, how this woman had embraced his ideology, and therefore he returned that love. And it is a very kind of special document in the middle of this period. The two converts are also ambivalent and ambiguous. Moses Margoliot is an extremely learned scholar of Judaism who is deeply committed to Jewish culture and Jewish scholarship. Who becomes a Christian after coming from Eastern Europe, settles in London, but then travels all over the world to the Holy Land and writes a book, writes a novel against the clergy, but soon becomes disenchanted towards the end of his life with the missionary group and with their encroachments upon Judaism, and thus affirms a belief in Jesus at the same time, a deep commitment to Jewish culture, perhaps a secular definition of what Jewish culture is. Stanislaw Hoga also is a person who is endearing initially to McCaul, is his right-hand man, translates his work, the liturgy of Christianity into Hebrew and many other works, but ultimately realizes that this is not the way, that Jews need to be Jews by observing the halakha. And as I understand him, he remains a Jew and a Christian simultaneously without giving up his Christian faith or returning as a Choser Teshuvah, but remains a Christian who believed that he needed to observe the halakha to fulfill himself as a Christian as well. The final three are also extremely interesting and also provide me with that ambiguity and that ambivalence which makes this book so interesting to me. The Ribal, Isaac Ber Levinson, is of course the father of the Eastern European Jewish Haskalah. He is very well known for his book Te'udah B'Yisrael. But the works that I worked on, he wrote two works, and I can't explain the origin of them. They appeared much later on, although he wrote them over a 20-year period. One is called Zerubbabel, the other is called Achish Shiloni HaChoser. They are both attempts to understand Judaism and to respond in kind of critical historical ways to McCaul. And similarly, Samuel David Feen writes a work called Darkei Hashem, which was never published, which exists only in one manuscript, but nevertheless reveals although he becomes a prolific author of the Haskalah, describes a world of maskilim, who on the one hand are critical of rabbinic Judaism, on the other hand have the need to present rabbinic Judaism in a positive light. They do so by reconstructing what Judaism is in a very historist way. I argue, particularly in the case of Feen, that Feen is very much influenced not so much by Krachmel, but by Krachmelian ideas, particularly emerging among the circle of Krachmel, Shir in particular, Rappaport, Joseph Lesch, who translated Philo in the 19th century, and a whole group of others. Ribal also has unbelievable sources in German, in Russian, which he consults. They are all historians of Christianity, and they present a view of Judaism versus Christianity, which presents Jews and Judaism in a favorable light. But nevertheless, the ambiguity remains. On the one hand, the Ribal attacks the Catholics and the Protestants for their brutality, for their cruelty to Jews. On the other hand, he sucks up, so to speak, to Christian noblemen and to Christian culture in general. We Jews have so much to learn from you. It is a remarkable maskilic pose. On the one hand, trying to identify with the elites of Christian society, at the same time cursing those Christian peasants who have brought us a world of immorality, which is in contrast to the way Jews live their lives and the way they develop and raise their families. The final character is Raphael Kasim, a Aleppo Jew who is, well, I always find these strange characters. Here is a guy that gets in trouble with everyone, writes two works on McCaul, both of them, one of them a translation into Ladino as well as Hebrew, in which he argues in a very strange way. He's not as erudite as the Maskilim. He's sitting in a Muslim world where the Christian missionaries have entered into the Middle East. We know a great deal about how they reached out to this Middle Eastern area. And he attacks them. At the same time, he appreciates the integrity of the Christian faith. He describes a dialogue where a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew are carrying on a conversation. He kind of ignores the Muslim, probably for censorship reason, but he talks about the Christian having the integrity to have a deep faith as long as he leaves the Jew alone. In other words, an appreciation for the other coming from a Jew sitting in the Middle East. I mean, it is really quite an extraordinary experience to see how he interprets this. He goes off to Europe for a period of time and disappears. At one point, he criticizes Reform Judaism. Another time, he's accused of establishing a Reform synagogue, believe it or not, if that's possible, in Aleppo. But clearly a rabbi with progressive views who is challenged by the world around him. I see I'm almost out of time. I have 2 or 3 minutes and I'm going to stop when I said I was going to stop. I did want to start to talk about some of Magid's points, but I will let him sort of lead me. And if he doesn't lead me into where I want to go, I'll get there anyway. Like the presidential debate, you sort of answer the way you want to answer. But I do want to say one thing. This is not simply a story of 19th century interactions. It seems to me, and particularly when the idea of mingled identities, the idea of what Shaul calls borderlands, is a story that is an early modern story. And I argue that quite strongly in singling out one characteristic of the early modern period, which I call mingled identities, or what Natalie Zeman Davis calls braided identities. In other words, in many respects, the story of my guy, McCaul, and his friends, and the story of Shaul's guy, the famous Eliyahu Tzvi Soloveitchik, has a long history, which begins in many ways at least in the early modern period in the 15th and 16th century. I want to close by mentioning an article that I wrote that I was very proud to give to Shaul. It's an essay which is entitled, Do Jews, I forgot what it's called, Do Jews, Is There a Monotheism Only for Jews? And it begins with Pico della Mirandola and ends with Shaul Magid. And he liked it, I think, because he was in a pantheon of a group of thinkers that began in the 16th century. And I enshrined him in this pantheon. And I'm sure he was famous before, but now he's even more famous. So I call Magid my Pico of the 21st century in many respects. But I also want to draw your attention to another character who I think is in many respects almost identical to Eliezer Tzvi Soloveitchik. And that is a man named Wilhelm Sorenusius, the translator of the Mishnah in the beginning of the 18th century into Latin, and his understanding of what the Mishnah does for Christianity. In other words, we have here a long history that is absolutely critical to understand if one wants to really trace the history of Jewish-Christian engagements with each other's traditions, drawing from them, inspired by them, at the same time resisting. So that wonderful interaction is what I'm doing in the 19th century, but it begins much earlier. I will stop then. 20 minutes, right?
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for the book. Those of you that haven't read it really should do so, because I don't think that David was able to do justice to the characters in the book. I mean, these incredibly colorful characters, especially the Jewish converts to Christianity, Stanislav Hoga and Moses Margoliot, and a couple of other people that are there. Just incredibly interesting figures that I think are somehow kind of lost in the telling of the story of Jewish modernity. So what I wanted to do is I want to try to raise a couple of issues that are kind of broader issues from the kind of the intricate and meticulous details of the book, to ask you a few questions and make a few comments. One of the things that I think you're doing in this book, and not only in this book, by the way, but I think in your career more generally, is that basically when we think about Jewish modernity, we really think on two tracks, either from the kind of Western European track, from Modus Mendelssohn to Geiger to Gratz and so on. And then you have, of course, like another Eastern European track that begins with people from the East that are influenced from the West, or according to Eliyahu Stern's book on the Vilna Gaon, maybe even deep within the bowels of traditionalism. But you're actually presenting a third story of Jewish modernity. And that is what I called in my review of your book, the theological borderlands of the 19th century. And that is not just Jews that polemicized against Christianity or Judaism that appropriated Christianity, but these borderlands where the whole question of Christianity loomed so large for both the Jews and the Christians and the Jewish Christians and the Jews who became Christians and the Jews who didn't quite become Christians. I mean, in a certain way, the story that you're telling in this book is basically, as I read it, and you'll tell me whether you agree, that ultimately, as hard as both Judaism and Christianity try, they actually can't extricate each other from themselves. They're just, it just doesn't work. There are times when Jews cannot pay attention to Christianity. There are times when Jews can polemicize against it, but ultimately Christianity is there and Judaism is there. And in a certain way, in the story that you tell in this book, you show how people's personal lives, either through converting to Christianity or Christians who somehow fall in love with Jews, but not necessarily Judaism, or they fall in love with Judaism, but not necessarily Jews. And then the whole modern question about whether Jews can be Jews without Judaism, which in a certain sense is really one of the great kind of innovations of Zionism. You don't need Judaism to be a Jew. Well, if you can be a Jew without Judaism, then why can't you be a Jew and be a Christian? And someone like Moses Margoliot basically makes that kind of argument, right? He's a clergy of the Church of England, and he very much considers himself a Jew. And the question of Stanislav Hoga, who's a much more tragic figure in many ways, also raises that issue. So I wanted to introduce a couple of different things and see maybe how you would respond to them that I got from the book. One of them is that the crucial notion of conversion as something that in the 21st century, we don't really think of conversion either to Christianity or from Christianity as so pivotal in understanding the nature of the trajectory of Jewish modernity. But what your book is showing is that conversion, whether to convert, what it means to convert, so on, is so crucial to so many of these people on a personal level, but also on a professional level. I mean, McCaul was the head of the Society to Convert the Jews, right? That's really what he wanted to do. And yet he also wanted to bring Christianity back to its Jewish origins at the same time. So the question of conversion, and I know I saw Todd Endelman's name in, Todd's Leaving the Jewish Fold book, where he introduces this distinction between converts of convenience and converts of conviction. I think what you do in your book and also in your other small book where you talk about Hoga is that while converts of conviction may have been much smaller in number than converts of convenience, they played a pivotal role in the formation of Judaism in modernity. And figures outside of the ones you study in your book, Emanuel Fruman's Hebrew commentary to the book of Luke, Nehemiah Solomon's translation of the New Testament to Yiddish in 1815. I mean, Augustus Neander, who becomes one of the great church historians of the 19th century, was from the Moses Mendelssohn family. I mean, there are many of these converts really play this important role. So the role of conversion. The second thing I want to raise, and I think I saw Talia there, is the role of Talmud. Since so much of what you talk about in your book is the debate about Judaism and Christianity really becomes a debate, not about the Hebrew Bible, but the status of the Talmud, the sacrality of the Talmud. And one of the things that got McCaul into a lot of trouble, as you show us, is the way, on the one hand, he's not in favor of biblical criticism, right? So the Christians are basically calling him a closet Jew. And on the other hand, he kind of sacralizes, or I should say, he sanctifies the Talmud against the maskilim who were involved in the process of kind of historicizing the Talmud. So the Talmud becomes this incredibly important piece to the story. The final thing that I want to raise is the way in which we see, as you say, this is not a 19th century story. This is also an 18th and 17th century story. It's also a 20th century story. So take people like Cardinal Luchtazé from Paris, or Oswald Rufusson, Brother Daniel. people in the 20th century who were, in a sense, I don't know whether these people knew McCaul or whether they knew Margoliouth or whether they knew Oxley or they knew these people, but they were engaged in the same process. When Rufusson tries to immigrate to Israel as a Benedictine monk and basically says that he's a Jew, right? Or the case of Luchtazé, who says he's a cardinal of Paris and basically says that he's a Jew, and he requested on his deathbed for Kaddish to be said at his funeral. And in fact, the chief rabbi of Paris got together a minyan outside of the Cathedral of Notre Dame after Luchtazé's funeral to recite Kaddish for him. So, or actually Luchtazé's brother, I think, recited Kaddish for him. So, I mean, it's interesting. We don't think of these characters as major figures in the kind of construction of Jews in the 20th century, but I think the story that you tell is that it really does go much further back and much further forward on that kind of question. So I just wanted to kind of leave it at there in saying that there is a third reading of Jewish modernity that you've introduced us to, which I'm calling the theological borderlands of the 19th century, where Judaism and Christianity are somehow inextricably tied together in terms of understanding what each one is and each one's relationship to the other. So I'll stop here and let you respond.
Oh, it's just so nice to listen to you talk about me. I would have you go on for another an hour, but I know I have to respond.
And Soloveitchik is another thing that we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah. I mean, it's all related. Everything is connected, as Richard Pumpkin used to say. Okay, theological borderlands, role of conversion, Talmud, 20th century story. I see this book as expanding the canon of Jewish thought in several ways. First of all, it is not simple. It is not a German Jewish story, which begins, as you said, with Mendelssohn and ends with Buber, Beck, and so on. And Rosenzweig. I was interested in somehow getting at Eastern European Jewish thought. I obviously am not an Eastern European Jewish historian, but in many respects, I found a way of getting there by looking at systematic responses to McCaul. In other words, it was a way, since Eastern European Jews didn't write systematic theology like the Germans, here is a way of looking how they were presenting Judaism in its full picture in their response to Christianity. So clearly Eastern Europe is a very important aspect, and of course the Jew from the Ottoman Empire. The story, therefore, is an international story. It begins in England, but it crosses the continent into Eastern Europe. It is also a story in which we now have a vast literature. You mentioned Edelman. There are several other wonderful books on converts in the modern era. It is a story of how converts play a role in the history of Jewish thought, and is also, here I'm arguing that even missionaries play a role in the history of Jewish thought. So yes, you're absolutely right that what you call a borderland is a conversation that is taking place. And one of the lines that you, in your review, which I absolutely love, and we'll come back to this point as well, many Jews today don't take Judaism as seriously as McCaul did, you wrote. Given the fact that McCaul really studied as best he could the Talmud and rabbinic literature before presenting his argument, and tried to do it. It was actually presented in English in a weekly periodical over the course of a year, and then it later on became a book. But indeed, it was written in installments. So so around Purim we have a Purim essay, around Pesach we have a Pesach essay, and so on and so forth. So clearly, you're absolutely right. Now, of course, the social historians will say, well, these are marginal people. They're so small. Converts of convenience, to use Todd's term again, were the overwhelming number of converts who simply did so for economic and social reasons. And even within the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity, most of their success stories, and they were limited success stories, were poor Jews who were basically looking for food and support and professional help and so on. Were not there to become ideologues of Judaism. Nevertheless, the intellectual historian in me, the cultural historian in me, is interested in those that articulated what they were doing and took it seriously. And while they were a minority, it seems to me they are interesting and they are part of a larger conversation about the place of Judaism within Western culture. So I clearly think this is important, whether it's a third wave or what's been going on. I guess I would put it in the context of the historiography of Yisrael Yuval. In other words, it's not simply a modern story. Yuval, as his critics, some of his critics say, like his brother-in-law Elchanan Reiner, he's obsessed with Christianity. He finds Christianity in Judaism in every corner of Jewish texts, and he can't see anything beyond that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But he, along with several other people, have explored the extraordinarily rich relationship that goes on in this conversation, sometimes out loud, sometimes silent, between Christianity and Judaism. Jews need to understand themselves by looking at the other. The image which Ruben Bonfil once used of looking in a mirror, looking at the other and seeing oneself in a mirror is the same idea. So what I've done then is taken that approach and brought it up into the 19th century, and also argued that even in the 19th century, Jewish-Christian debate is still a relevant forum for interaction between Jews and Christians. You're absolutely right about all of these converts. There are so many more. The reason why I wrote a previous book on Moses Marcus, who was a convert in the 18th century, was that after reading Elisheva Karlbach's wonderful book about German converts and seeing Marcus in a footnote, I mean, what she left us was a template for writing 20 other books, because each one of them deserved an individual story. And that's why I proceeded in that one case. So you only can do it. And I did the same thing. The chapter that I like the most is the Margolio chapter, because I had the materials, the tools there to really talk about a life, including personal letters about his divorce with his wife and all kinds of intimate things, which I would never have as an early modern historian. In the 19th century, you can find such things. But clearly, this story has not fully been told. You mentioned Froman. I would also mention Kemper. We now have a new dissertation from the Hebrew University. I forgot the guy's name, but it's disappointing in that it's not as radical as we think it is, or that the thought of Kemper was. But nevertheless, here is a guy that's writing also commentaries on the New Testament, and therefore needs to be considered. And a Jew who also believed in the Halakha at the same time. He was writing commentaries on the Kabbalah, and he was a Sabbatean. All of these things suggest this wonderful complexity. So there's much more to be done. Neander is an extremely important figure, as you say. I touch upon him for his views on Philo, which are really quite interesting, and which it seems to me Fien is reacting to. But that's a story into itself. Yes, this is also the role of the Talmud. Absolutely. At the same time, when you take this story into the 20th century, one of the assumptions that McCaul was writing to Jews who knew Talmud and who studied Talmud and made it part of their lives. When you enter the 20th century, you experience the illiteracy of Jews, their separation or their distancing themselves from their own rabbinic culture. Try to read these Maskilim now. In other words, Zerubbabel, which is an incredible response to Netivot Olam, makes. I don't know what that is. Is that what's called an invader or something? Or no? Just somebody turned on music. I was hoping some evangelicals would join this group. Who knows? But in any case, the question of the relevancy of this depends on a Jewish culture which is grounded in rabbinics. You can't appreciate McCaul unless you can understand his arguments and dethrone them. It's very interesting that while there is one or two responses to McCaul in England, Moses Montefiore went off to Eastern Europe to find someone worthy of responding to McCaul. He couldn't find them in England, and he knew that in England he couldn't publish a work where English Jews who were highly assimilated would be able to read and appreciate this. What was being published for Jews in England were prayer books and catechisms on the lowest level to try to instruct people in Judaism. So this is a conversation that still takes place within the traditional bounds of Jewish learning, of rabbinic learning. When that learning passes, McCaul and his colleagues find that their work is clearly irrelevant. I quote a missionary of London Society at the end of the 19th century in the book. It was an evaluation, a wonderful questionnaire that was sent out to missionaries in London Society all over the place, evaluating what books and materials they are using, whether they're still relevant for missionaries. And all of them say, well, McCaul's work is at the heart of what we are doing, but it really needs to be rewritten. Jews don't, what about nationalism? What about socialism? What about the liberalism? We are in another world for Jews, and we appreciate that this book cannot speak any longer to the heart of the late 19th, early 20th century Jew. So in that sense, it's interesting. It's a relic. Although if you go on Google today, you will find up-to-date versions of McCaul all over the place. Perhaps not Levinson and Feen, but McCaul is still read and popularized. I can't understand how a Christian can read it and totally appreciate it, but nevertheless, it is still considered to be a bestseller in that respect. So I'm not sure I answered all of your questions, but
no.
All right.
I mean, I want to also, if I could, just raise the issue of Soloveitchik, because
yeah, and I have questions. Go on.
Yeah, because Soloveitchik, what does it mean for a Jew from Volozhin, from Lithuania, who's the grandson of Chaim of Volozhin, to fall in love with Christianity and not convert, but write a commentary to the gospel, making the claim that there really is no theological disparity between Judaism and Christianity. Now, he doesn't say this, but my hunch was, because he doesn't ever mention McCaul and he doesn't ever mention the society, but he clearly I think he probably knew about it. My hunch is that Soloveitchik was also addressing the conversion question, to say to Jews, you don't have to convert to Christianity, not because Judaism is superior, but because they're both the same. In other words, to make an argument against conversion because it's not necessary, as opposed to saying don't become a Christian because, in a polemical sense. So it's a kind of the inverse of polemics in a way. Now, it would be interesting to think about what someone like McCaul would make of Soloveitchik's Kol Koreh, his commentary to the gospel, right? Because basically what Soloveitchik is doing is giving us a kind of Maimonidean Jesus. He's saying that Jesus was a kind of a maskilic Maimonidean figure who basically understood the Hebrew Bible outside of the Talmudic distortion, so to speak. I mean, Soloveitchik doesn't say that, but in a certain sense, he's kind of bringing it back home. And that's what McCaul seemed to want to do to Christianity. He wanted to bring it back home in a way, right? But he wanted to bring it back to a Judaism before rabbinic Judaism. That's how I understand McCaul's old paths, and that's how I understand your presentation of him. So that's a kind of very interesting intellectual polemic that's going on internal to the Jews too, vis-a-vis Orthodox Jews versus Reform Jews. What's really the core of Judaism? Is it the Hebrew Bible? Is it the Talmud? Is it the Rab? There's that same kind of tension that exists in Jewish modernity. What is the true Judaism to return to is happening between Jews and Christians and in those borderlands as well. So I found that actually fascinating, drawing out from these characters that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would have loved to see a conversation between McCaul and Soloveitchik. I would also have liked to see a conversation between Soloveitchik and my Maskilim. In other words, they're not so far apart, although Soloveitchik is not going to historicize Judaism. but there's so many questions that you leave unanswered about Soloveitchik, and which it seems to me, I'm just, it's my hush that they're important. We don't know anything about what happens to him when he travels to Königsberg, and when he goes to London, and the need for translation. Translation as an urge of the modern era suggests a larger cultural world, a need to broadcast his views way beyond traditional Judaism. Who is his audience? Who is he writing this to? Yes, it comes out in Hebrew, but it's in French, it's in German, it's in English. In other words, he's not your typical Soloveitchik in that sense. In that, you define him as Volodyan, but he's much more than Volodyan. So he's already seems to have made a move. Whether we can actually identify those moves, outright or not, right. He doesn't seem to be your typical traditional rabbi at all. Way, way beyond it. Not simply because he wants to write on the New Testament, but because of his intellectual and physical movement to Western Europe. Can we say anything more about that aspect of him that makes
one of the funny things of writing about a person like that is we know so little about him. We do know that most of his travels had to do with finding medical attention. He seemed to be a very sickly person. He becomes blind once he's in London. So we don't really know that much about what he was reading at that point. I mean, my sense was, and by the way, you're right, he had no use for people like Geiger. He thought that the Reform Jews were completely off track. He would rather talk to Roman Catholics than he would talk to, a Reformed Jew. But I think, and I tried to make this claim in the book, I think that the reason why he gets it translated into French, not only French and German, but he gets it translated into Polish also, is that he felt that his commentary to the New Testament was going to be the solution to anti-Semitism. He felt that Christians didn't understand that the gospel was rooted in Judaism, and that Jews didn't understand that the gospel was rooted in Judaism. And so when both sides understood the symmetry between them, Christians would no longer hate the Jews, and the Jews would no longer hate the Goyim. I mean, it's a very different kind of imbalanced thing, right? Because Jews really didn't have any power over, they had no way to police and enact their animosity. But I think that seems to be why he wanted to become a kind of international figure. I mean, he's very tragic in a lot of ways because he's impoverished his entire life. He never attracted a following. He attracted a couple of Christian patrons who were able to get his book into the Vatican. But other than that, he really kind of falls very, very quickly into obscurity, which is true of your people too, except the difference is, I think that McCaul, like who would Stanislav Hoga be without McCaul, right? He would be a nobody. I mean, he was a nobody with McCaul, but he would really be a lost soul. So in a way, the conversion to Christianity, or Moshe Margoliot, the conversion to Christianity gives a lot of your figures a certain kind of life, right? And it gives them a purpose. Whereas Soloveitchik, he's an ultra-Orthodox Jew from Lithuania who somehow falls in love with Christianity, but yet has no interest whatsoever in becoming a Christian. Not because he thought Christianity was treif, but because there was no need to. I think that's if there's a chiddush in Soloveitchik, it's that he felt that Christianity and Judaism were so similar, so why would you need to convert at all? Right. So in some way he is a kind of anomalous character.
I can't help it. I've been spending the last 6-7 months working on another character named Solomon Bennett, Yom Tov Bennett, who was an engraver who came also from Russia through Germany and Copenhagen and then ended up in London, and does not convert either, but becomes a sharp critic of the translations of the Christians, alienates himself totally from the chief rabbinate and tries to usurp some of their authority. An extremely complicated figure, but he also goes blind, like your character.
Right.
And it's almost the exact same period of time. Again, he finds the option of remaining a Jew and articulating his own Jewishness. At the same time, he shares so much with these Christians. So we are looking at something which, this kind of nuanced or this complicated relationship where we can't put them in various camps. Makes them extremely interesting. Do you think he had ties with the Orthodox Jewish community in London? I mean, do we have any larger relationship to other Jews when he moves from Königsberg to London and so on, or he's still an isolated figure only through his writings?
Yeah, we really don't know. I mean, we really have no, we have no knowledge. I mean, his great grandson is Paul Salovey, who's the president of Yale University. And in conversations with Paul, he said that he remembers stories about him that his father and grandfather told him, but not really kind of in any detail. His Soloveitchik's daughter moved to Palestine. And so the family then lived in Palestine for a few generations before they ended up moving to America. So that's kind of really what we know. I wanted to say one more thing, and that is that, and this goes back to the first thing I said. When we normally think about, when we teach courses in Judaism, modernity, and Jewish and modern Jewish thought, and all of that stuff, we basically focus very often on that the real issue of Jews and modernity was the question of emancipation. Were Jews going to be able to, as Jacob Katz said, come out of the ghetto? Were they going to be able to integrate into that society? There are two other aspects to this. One of which I think you bring up in your book. The first aspect is really what Gershom Scholem said, and said, no, you can't understand Jews and modernity without Sabbateanism. You simply can't do it. Sabbateanism, although now is a kind of dead letter, and Elisheva Karlbach in her book on Moshe Chagiz talks about this, you can't understand Jewish modernity in Europe without understanding the impact of Sabbateanism. And the second thing that the second piece of it, which you bring up, is this question of conversion. We don't think about that anymore because conversion isn't an issue for us in the world that we live in. But the idea of conversion weighed so heavy on so many Jews for so many reasons, whether it was convenience or conviction, it really didn't matter, that we can't understand the story of Jewish modernity without that. And perhaps you can look at Rosenzweig's famous, dark night of the soul, when he has to decide whether he's going to become a Christian. Mendelssohn has to respond to Lavater's a challenge of Christianity. I mean, you have it in those figures, but somehow it never really gets played into the centrality of the discussions about Judaism and modernity. And I think that your book really pushes us to say we can't do it without this.
Well, we're playing around with Mishumadim, who were clearly
right.
And we had to overcome that interest, which Todd and others have championed. But now we're going a step farther and bringing them into Jewish discussions of Judaism and Jewish thought.
Right.
So we're arguing that indeed they're still struggling with their Jewish identity even after they convert, or even if they're not converting, and so on.
So let me ask you then. So take it to the present. So where does this go for us now in terms of how these identities these fungible identities are being negotiated? Given that you have the American diaspora, you have Israel, which has a very different kind of template. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, I just wanted to say one quick thing before that, but you're actually moving in exactly the direction I wanted to go into, and here perhaps we will we'll see how close we are, or how different we are. But the earlier point, I wanted to also argue that Christian Hebraicism, it was very interesting. I had Theo Dunkelgrun gave a lecture a week or two ago in Antwerp, which a lot of people listen to. I have my weekly conversation with my friend Elchanan Reiner in Israel, and he didn't like it. He says, why are we talking about Christian Hebraism? Let's talk about real things, about Judaism. He's moved too much in the direction of Christian Hebraism. And we got into an argument. But having spent a year studying Suranusius with Joanna Weinberg and her group in Oxford, and actually writing on him earlier, I want to add that they're part of the conversation too. How they're reacting to Judaism is influencing Jews ultimately and is making the conversation even much larger. So again, we have to include not only the Soloveitchiks and other Jews in this conversation, but we also have to include these Christians that are approaching Judaism in loving ways, in meaningful ways, although they're not converting either. And thus the conversation becomes even more complex. But their process is also a process that we have to see as a part of Jewish cultural history. That's my point. Now, regarding the modern era, so you start with Dabru Emet. What I felt you were doing in the review, I mean, let me start talking about Magid and then sort of answer the question that way. You were kind of using me to make an argument about, first of all, the relevance of Dabru Emet 20 years later. And second of all, the idea that that borderland is absolutely critical in understanding the present world we live in, where Jews have assimilated into the larger culture and are part of a very intense dialogue with the outside world, and that I don't know if you want to say these were role models or these were predecessors or these were paradigms of Jewishness that were going on in the 19th century that provide a context for understanding what is going on today. But clearly, you know, those who are, I remember I gave this lecture a year ago in Northwestern before the book had come out, and there were a whole row of Jews for Jesus people sitting there. And they were thrilled with what I was saying. I was giving them a kind of ideological justification for what they were doing, and they could see their own activity in the historical context of 19th century, even earlier. Does that work for our world? I already raised the issue of Jewish literacy and that how difficult it is to carry on a conversation. I'm clearly in favor of Dabru Emet and for us to speak intensely with Christianity and to grow. My commitment to the university in my 45 years is about expanding the conversation, is about being asked questions that are never asked within the four walls of the yeshiva, and forcing Jews. In that sense, I am fully Maimonidean. But how far do we take this? I mean, is the question. And while history can provide us with some kind of context for where we are to see that there's nothing new under the sun, there still is something new about the world that we live in. And the dramatic break-off from Judaism is not simply a function of ideology or a function of belief. It's a function of unfamiliarity, of illiteracy, of social removal from a Jewish community, which provides sustenance and intense exposure to Jewish symbols. Without that, what is there, and is this conversation relevant? But that's the whole question: is intellectual history relevant to the larger social history of? I remember attacking in my lecture, and Arnie Eisen heard it because it was recorded for the Great Teachers course. Arnie Eisen's kind of nostalgia approach to the modern age, you know, kind of social historical approach, seeing, you know, the Seder and the social, and that Jewish thought wasn't that relevant any longer. He had got tired of Derrida and Rosenzweig as he moved in to become chancellor of the seminary. So I don't know. I mean, that's the question. What is the relevance of all of this for our modern world? Clearly, evangelicals are very much around. Jews are embracing them in all kinds of ways, politically and otherwise. There is this love-hate relationship that goes on. This mingling goes on. But is it indeed the same social cultural world that you describe in your post-Judaism book? In other words, does this sanction a denominationalist Judaism, to put it in Magid's terms, or are we going too far with this material?
No, I think
last question: were you using my book as a means of strengthening your own theology?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if I was doing it intentionally, but I think that's kind of what came out. I will say, I mean, I think it's a great question. What is the American diaspora's obligation toward the larger culture around it? do we see ourselves as simply another instantiation of exile, and therefore we have to kind of protect our boundaries, we have to build fences around ourselves ideologically? Yes, we can integrate and acculturate and so on and so forth, but let's not give away too much. And that was kind of Soloveitchik's confrontation, Joseph Soloveitchik's confrontation essay about, well, we can talk to Christians, but not about theological matters. Right. Because when you talk, because it's an imbalance, you're talking about a majority culture and a minority culture. The question is, does that still apply, or has something actually changed? Now, of course, Israel actually is an important piece to this, because you have the kind of newfound love of Israel by evangelical Christians, right? It's not a newfound love of Judaism, but it's a newfound love of Israel and therefore Jews. So in a certain sense, they are adopting the modern Jewish frame of you can be a Jew without Judaism, right? And then using it for their own political purposes. So how do we respond to that? I think that the Dabru Emet question is an ongoing one, and I think John Levinson's critique of it in commentary, which I also mentioned in the essay, is a very important one. In other words, I don't know what the history, what the subsequent future of Dabru Emet will be. But what Dabru Emet is saying is that Vatican II was a seismic change in the relationship of Christians to Jews. Now, of course, Vatican II only applies to Catholics, not to Protestants, so it's a more complicated question. But if it is that Christianity is willing to engage like dual covenant theology and all these kinds of questions of, trying to deconstruct supersessionism, the Jews have a responsibility to respond in kind. And I think it's an open question, and I think it's a debate that we should actually be having. And in a way, what your book shows, and therefore it was the groundwork to say, oh, but this is not a new conversation. These borderlands were happening all the time. Obviously, it was a very different social context. Jews were being persecuted. Becoming a Christian really, one where there were a lot of advantages to becoming a Christian. But nonetheless, those battles, can we reproduce a borderlands in America, in 21st century America, that conforms to the very particular American context that we're living in? And I think that the kinds of stuff that you've been doing, and it's not only this book, I think just in general, in your work, in general, you're really kind of saying, not that, oh, here's a historical paradigm, let's replicate it, but we're not reinventing the wheel here. There is this underground history of Jewish modernity that you're telling that has not been told before. And I think is in many ways, much more relevant than Moses Mendelssohn. As relevant as Moses Mendelssohn may still be, or Hermann Cohen, or even Franz Rosenzweig. But of course, Franz Rosenzweig got what you were doing. He just didn't know these figures. But he understood the importance of Christianity as a motif and as a paradigm for understanding his own Jewishness.
Yeah. I'm not going to disagree with any of that. I think that's all very interesting. I'm not sure I'm going to go out and join the ecumenical conversation. The problem, of course, again, is who can speak for the rabbinic tradition, except for those who have isolated themselves from this conversation in the first place. In other words, we still have a real problem of how we present Judaism to a non-Jewish world. And how do we do that before we are first informed about our own tradition? Right. And that's really, but maybe it's university professors that will do it,
But Francesca, do you want to open it up for questions?
I think, yes. I think, first of all, thank you so much for this really fruitful conversation. But I think this is a good moment to open up to the public. And there already are a few questions and a few comments. There's a question from Todd Endelman that came in early in the conversation. And Todd would like to ask David whether the kind of theological ambivalence and ambiguity that you're talking about was largely a manifestation of a Protestant culture with a long history of bibliocentricity and philosemitism. So is it a particularly Protestant story?
Good. I didn't know Todd was there. Hi, Todd. Yeah, I think I would agree with you. That raises the interesting issue that Eliyahu Stern has recently raised in an essay, I forgot the title, but has Catholic Judaism in the words, in which he argues that two of the maskilim that I deal with were influenced by Catholic thought. And I don't accept his interpretation, but it's certainly worth reading his interpretation and considering it. But I think I agree with you. I think that clearly the biblical-based Judaism, the biblical-based Christianity was indeed the spark plug which got this whole conversation going, certainly in the 19th century. We could argue in earlier periods, in the early modern period, as I begin to think more about this, that there was a more fruitful dialogue between Catholics and Jews. I mean, we're going back to Italy and speaking about people like Modena or Luzzatto. These guys were speaking about, they were quote unquote Catholic Jews in the sense that they were trying to shape their understanding of Judaism within the context of a Catholic world. They even made the argument that what brings Jews closer to Catholicism is the fact that there is a mediated tradition from the text itself through the church fathers, similar to that of the Talmud. So clearly for them, it was possible to construct a dialogue. And of course, Ben Mosaic is creating in the 19th and 20th century a dialogue between Catholicism and Judaism in this respect. But I do agree with the gist of Todd's question that much of this is spurred by those who come out of the Protestant world.
I mean, I think I would just add that, you know, I saw Clement. So, I mean, Clement Baluch's recent book on Elias Ben Mosaic really makes a very strong case. I mean, he's writing from Livorno, makes a very strong case that it's really Catholicism in a way more than Protestantism
Right.
that holds the potential for that kind of exchange. Yeah.
I saw
So
your answer there.
there aren't, the earlier, there were comments rather than questions early on. So there's a comment by Alan Shore that writes, I view Judaism and Christianity as conjoined twins, joined at the chest, sharing a bloodstream, unable to get away from each other, and sentenced to stare directly into each other's eyes, whether they like it or not. And I think many of your comments already addressed this, but there was also a suggestion from Mel Skolt, who's a scholar of Mordecai Kaplan. And he writes, reports of the London Society in their publication, The Jewish Expositor and Friend of Israel from 1815, 1830, contains an enormous amount of material of a population sort. Missionaries report regularly on villages they visit and report the number of Jews. They do this year after year, and he says, I don't know if this resource has been used at all. Do you know, do you want to address the...
Yeah. Well, of course, Mel Scott was one of the first to study the London Society for the promotion of Christianity among the Jews. He was a chalutz in this area. I did spend a month working through the London Society archives, and I should mention the name of, I have it right over there. Who am I talking about? I'm having a senior moment. This wonderful Polish woman from Wacław, who has written a history of the London Society in Poland.
Agnieszka Jagodzińska?
Yeah, you got it.
It's Marcin Wojcinski.
Yeah, Marcin, exactly. Well, she has a number of articles in English. I wasn't able to read the Polish book, only the summary. But she worked with me and helped me a lot with maneuver that archive. But you're right, going through the periodicals, there is such a self-importance or a self-consciousness. I don't know how these missionaries have to record everything. And they go into synagogues and record sermons, and they record book reviews. And there's such a live, in other words, you try to understand, what are they doing? I mean, they're reporting on their missionary activity, sure, but they're also recording every aspect of Jewish life from their perspective. And it's a fascinating, I mean, I went through many of these looking particularly from the angle of McCaul, but there is still so much more. They are very rich sources, and I'm glad that Mel mentioned their presence. They are still very much around, and that archive in the Bodleian is extremely rich. All of their papers, all of their minute books, all of their pamphlets are there, and there's a lot to read. They wrote a lot about themselves.
There's another comment by Mel on Kaplan. Kaplan's notion that all religions were similar and only differed in terms of their sancta is similar to what Soloveitchik was saying, and I wonder if Shaul wants to address that.
Yeah, I mean, Kaplan does do that. I mean, I find it interesting that and this is really a question back to Mel. I think I find it interesting that Kaplan doesn't really spend a lot of time dealing with other religions in general. I mean, for somebody who was so, radical in his rewriting of Judaism, he doesn't, I mean, he does mention that, as you say, which I think was actually quite common in his time, that idea of the kind of similitude of religions and the difference in sanctity. I mean, that idea of the oneness of all religions was quite popular. But it's interesting that Kaplan stays away from the question of Christianity, stays away from the question of Islam. Obviously, that wasn't such a question in America at his time. But yeah, in some way, I think that Soloveitchik is making that argument, but he's making it in a very particular way and specific to Christianity. I don't know if Kaplan was being specific to Christianity. Soloveitchik doesn't think that way. He doesn't talk about any other religion, but I think there's something very specific to Christianity that is on Soloveitchik's mind, as opposed to kind of a more world religion perspective that might have been more popular in the 20th century.
A further question by Yanni Tsiligakis. Are Christians justified in asserting a textual supremacy to Jews, since the Septuagint is the closest to the vernacular text of Judaism and it contradicts the much later recreated and altered Masoretic texts? Do you see such debates historically between Jews and Christians? If you want to take this question.
You're entering a very complicated world of scholarship. I'll have to let Septuagint scholars argue that more authoritatively than I can, but clearly I'm not at all convinced that the Masoretic text is not the most original. I think the Septuagint is derivative, and I think these are much heated debates that go on from the early modern period on about the nature of the text. I wrote about this considerably in the context of England in the 18th century in another book. But the history of the Masoretic text, we now have so much more literature on this subject. It's interesting that exactly this question is the question that my present love object, Bennett in England, is arguing that there is only one Hebrew text that is the original, and that only a Jew can really understand it, and that's why we need a new version of the King James, because Christian translations are corrupt, and he translates the entire Bible. But irregardless of the English context, I think your question calls for a lot more authoritative answer than I can offer. But I would argue, I would question the notion that the Septuagint is the closest to the vernacular text of Judaism. And let's turn to scholars who can answer that question more authoritatively.
As a parenthetical comment, one of the questions that I had to deal with in doing the translation of Soloveitchik's Hebrew commentary was what New Testament was he reading? He didn't seem to read Greek, so that probably wasn't the case. I kind of landed on the fact that he probably had access to Franz Delitzsch's Hebrew translation of the New Testament, which is translated into rabbinic Hebrew, by the way. Right. And at that time, Delitzsch and other scholars held that the New Testament that was originally written in Hebrew and only later translated into Greek. Of course, we know now that that's not the case. I don't think there are any New Testament scholars that think that there was an original Hebrew version of the New Testament that was then later translated into Greek. But I think again, my wife is, among other things, a Dead Sea Scroll scholar, so she would probably be best to know the answer, but she's not here right now, so I'll have to just wait.
We'll ask her, both of us.
We'll ask her, yeah.
I don't see any more questions coming in. Are there any other thoughts or final comments? Back to both of you, David and Shaul.
I mean, I really hope that, I know David's probably on to something else now. I don't know what his new project is, but maybe he'll tell us. But I hope that, you know, one of the things that one of my, you know, mentors told me is that a good book, or he was talking about a dissertation, but a good book is not one that actually exhausts a topic, but what actually opens a topic. And I really hope that David's book really opens up a topic for people to continue to excavate and investigate, not only as social historians or intellectual historians, but also people that are interested in thought and philosophy and theology, to really begin to rethink the categories of Jewish modernity as a way of retelling the story as from the 21st century. So that would be my hope, that the book is really succeeds in that way, and that it begins a conversation rather than ends one.
That's probably the way we should end. That's really a great ending. But let me just add, at a very early stage of writing this book, well, actually, when I had finished the first draft, there was a reader for the press that objected to this book because it didn't focus more on the history of one society on the one hand, or on the political context of missionaries and the larger question of British imperialism and colonialism and so on. But also, and this is what really got me, Ruderman deals with secondary characters of great insignificance. I guess that's the story of my own historiography, of my own writing, that I like to look at people that are sort of hidden in the crevices or in the corners that have not been studied by others. Edel, in reviewing my book on modern on science, compares it with, he also makes the same argument that, and in fact, dealing with a group of scholars that have not been treated, or intellectuals that have not been treated before, it seems that, you know, in excavating, it's a kind of tichiyat hametim, you know, we sort of raise them from the dead, and maybe have them speak to us. And that's what Shaul seems to be doing with this book of, I mean, I just fell in love with these guys, as I fall in love with every subject I write on. But if indeed they speak to us and our generation, they certainly speak to me. And what I get out of this conversation was how close I actually am to Shaul's position. I was resisting him for a while, but it seems that we need to l'daber emet, so we are on the same wavelength. But in any case, I appreciate what you're saying, and I will continue to look at secondary figures. And the one I'm writing a monograph on now is this guy, Solomon Bennett, who lives in the same world. And Todd has been helping me, among others. And we'll go forward with another small story, which may become a bigger story if indeed it resonates in people like you.
I think this is a good moment to stop our conversation. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank you especially David Ruderman and Shaul Magid for such a fruitful conversation.
Francesca, for organizing this.
Thank you all. It's been wonderful, and it's also been wonderful to see so many friends from all over. Again, this meeting will be available on YouTube later. So if you missed the first part, I saw that there was a second wave of arrivals from Europe. We're now 5 hours instead of 6 hours behind. So perhaps that may have caused some late arrivals, but the meeting will be available. Again, thank you so much.
Francesca, could you put the YouTube channel in the chat? A couple of people asked where they can access it.
Oh, I need to find it. So that may take a moment. And it may be perhaps better it will be sent out as an email, and
Okay,
we also have a Facebook page. So please follow us on Facebook, and I'll make sure to update the Facebook page. I'm afraid I don't know how to find that YouTube channel at the moment. We also have another event coming up on November 5th at 6 p.m. It will be a conversation between Ayla Fader and Omri Elisha on Ayla Fader's recent book, Hidden Heretics, which should be really interesting. So thank you again for coming, and I hope to see you all soon. Thanks again, David and Shaul.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Shaul.
Thank you, David. Look forward to reading your next book.
Yeah, Agnieszka was on. I
Yeah,
saw
she was on. Yeah.
and I messed up her name. I feel terrible, but she's a great scholar.
Yeah, you write books faster than we can read them, David. You have to give us a little.
Well, it's going to take a while, but you know, what else do I do here to keep my sanity? You know, I don't know.